Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Leah, and I work at the library. And welcome to the second night of our first online mountain story and Mountain Story 2021, where great adventure meets great writing. After tonight, we have how many more events? 4 more events. We have 6 events this season, so that's exciting. 2 next week. So hopefully you'll join us. Go to tclib.org and find our Mountain Story website. Does anyone have any questions on Zoom before we begin? Okay, so I will introduce the speaker of the evening, Bruce Kirkby, who we've been actually trying to get for a couple years, but because he lives in Canada, it makes it hard. So this is one of those rare silver linings of the pandemic where we get the treat of having people abroad visit us in Jackson Hole. So that is exciting. And Bruce Kirkby is a wilderness writer and adventure photographer recognized for connecting wild places with contemporary issues. With journeys spanning more than 80 countries in 30 years, Kirkby's accomplishments include the first modern crossing of Arabia's empty quarter by camel, a descent of Ethiopia's Blue Nile Gorge by raft, a sea kayak traverse of Borneo's northern coast, and a coast-to-coast Icelandic trek. A former columnist for the Globe and Mail, author of 3 best-selling books, and winner of multiple national magazine awards, Kirkby's work has appeared in the New York Times, Outside Magazine, and Canadian Geographic. He makes his home in Kimberley, British Columbia. Without further ado, Bruce.
Leah, thank you. Thank you very much. It's amazing that we finally worked this out, because I was trying to come, I guess, a couple of years ago when you had Kevin Federico down there. And so first of all, thanks to you for putting on events like this, in a time like this, because they're important. And mostly I want to thank everyone who's shown up. And it's almost astounding to me, because we're bleeding to death by Zoom in a way, and you've been at Zoom meetings probably all day. Even my 82-year-old mother just moved in down the street, and she has Zoom knitting and Zoom choir. And so hopefully, despite the kind of impersonal environment that we're connected in, that we can travel together to some different places and just explore some different ways of thinking, different ways of seeing the world, different possibilities. That's certainly what I want to bring. There's a couple of things I want to say just before we get going. The first is that I'm joining you from Kimberley, BC. So this is actually that we have our own little Teton in town. That's Fisher Peak. It's in the Rocky Mountains on the west slope of the Rockies. And we're in the Rocky Mountain Trench between the Rocky Mountains and the Columbias. And that's a view from my front porch. So we're north of Flathead Country and north of Kalispell and Whitefish. If you've been, for sure, fire a little comment in the box, but I do think we stay off the map. I think that's a bit of a plan by the village elders, because in this age of super hyper slick marketing, we maintain as our village mascot a drunk lederhosen wearing miner. So this tends to keep people away. But everything changes, and people are finding us. The other thing, basically today we're going to talk about this new book that I've released, which is the story of my wife and I taking our 2 young boys to live for a time in Karshigampa, which is a Himalayan Buddhist monastery in the valley of Zanskar. And Zanskar is located kind of in that tangle of peaks and knotted contested borders where Pakistan and China and India collide. Before we get to that, though, if you've been to Zanskar, if you ever have questions while I'm talking, I'd love to have this, more discussion and less just me blah, blah, blah. So please feel free to, at any time, put a comment or a question into the little chat box. As soon as I see it, I'll get to it. It won't throw me off. And we will have a Q&A for sure at the end. So with that said, let's start off right away with the beginning of this story, which is May 5th in 2014. And my wife and our 2 sons, who were 7 and 3 at the time, Bodhi in the green shirt is 7 and Taj in black is 3. We literally came out our back door. We'd been talking to our boys about this. But as anyone who's had children knows, time is a somewhat nebulous factor to them. And really their only foundation is mom and dad. And so they really, I realize in retrospect, had no idea what was happening at this moment. We live near the headwaters of the Columbia River. So we launched a couple canoes and paddled north for about 5 days through these just gorgeous wetlands, a migratory kind of touchdown spot. And so occasional cracks of beaver tails and, serenaded by red-winged blackbirds on last year's bulrushes. And 5 days later, we arrived in the lumber town and now the ski town of Golden, BC. And we stashed those canoes in a friend's back garden, went out to the Trans-Canadian rail line, flagged down a train that was headed towards the coast. And 2 days later in Vancouver, we boarded a 77,000 ton container ship that was headed across the North Pacific. It was destined to be a 14-day voyage, or it was planned to be. It ended up being 17 days. We got diverted to Russia for buying fuel that they were discounting. They were short on cash. And so every container ship in the North Pacific went to Nahodka, Russia. But we made landfall 17 days later in Busan, South Korea. And we started this great overland journey by train and by car, by rickshaw and riverboat. We went through Korea, into China, up and over Tibet, visited Northside Mount Everest base camp with my boys, which was extraordinary to have them there. And we had a bluebird day, just incredible views of the north face of Everest, and then descended on the far side into the Terai and jungle of Nepal, finally out onto the scorching hot plains of India, and visited, I'm sure, places that many of you are familiar with, the pungent and acrid burning ghats in Varanasi. We visited my younger son's namesake, the Taj Mahal. It was 38 degrees this day. It was just absolutely sweltering. And finally, we started to make our way up into the foothills from Chandigarh to Shimla to Manali, Kalimpong. And then from the tiny military outpost of Darsha, we started a 10-day hike, trek, supported by ponies or small horses, following these ancient footpaths that have been carved into the edges of canyons and gorges over the Great Himalaya Range. And it was 100 days after we left our home here in Kimberley, BC, that we arrived at the base of these cliffs. And this is Karshigampa, where we would be staying. It's a 1,000-year-old Buddhist monastery. And at this point, you may be asking, what on earth is wrong with you? What were you thinking? You got two, is there not an easier way you could take a vacation with two young boys? And so I think I need to backtrack even a little bit further. And really the book opens on a moment that I think that's common in all of humanity. When we pause and ask ourselves suddenly, how did I get here? How has my life evolved into this? Is kind of all of a sudden caught up with me. Maybe there's that sense of, I don't think this is how I actually want to live. And what was really perturbing me as the book opens is my attention, or my lack of it. And I am a bit of a Luddite. I was a slow adopter, but I bought this thing called an iPhone, and someone said, you need to join Twitter and Facebook. So I did. And all of a sudden I was watching what people were eating in Toronto, instead of paying attention to like my two beautiful boys. And there was a moment when Bodhi said, you didn't hear anything I just said. And I knew he was right. And I knew in that moment that I was wrong, and that wasn't how I wanted to be. And we weren't so fluent in digital distraction and all these things at this point. This was as these appetites were catching up with us. And for many years, my wife and I had kind of really loosely and vaguely discussed this idea of taking the boys to live in a Himalayan Buddhist monastery. And we came at it from very different angles. My background is I'm an engineering physicist. My dad was a nuclear physicist. I'm very pragmatic and practical. And so I don't want to say that I am an unspiritual individual, but I'm perhaps less open than my wife, who is like fully into, healing crystals and spirit animals and Mercury in retrograde and all these things that I would intensely question her on. But the one place that our Venn diagrams overlapped was an interest, a really heartfelt interest in Himalayan Buddhism. And for me, many, many expeditions to Nepal and other areas in the Himalaya, I'm sure many of you have experienced this, I was profoundly impacted by my Sherpa companions, by their generosity, by their extraordinary humbleness despite their strength, by their equanimity in the face of all types of pressures. And in a sense, like, not to make light of it, I was like, whatever these guys' secret sauce is, I would like some, because they are living, they're an incarnation of how, to me, seems a successful way to live. My wife had never been to the Himalaya, but she had studied Tibetan Buddhism for an entire year in the basement of a Calgary community center, and really understood the history and the iconography and all this stuff. And so we kind of had this idea that maybe we would go sometime. But it was always something that would happen someday, just kind of this future plan. And then we had this incident when I was eating breakfast with the boys, not paying attention to them, and was shocked by Bodhi's clarity and seeing I wasn't paying attention. And within a few days, we decided we needed to go to the Himalaya. And so we set out, not in search of Shangri-La, not in search of enlightenment, not in search of any of those kind of tired tropes that we maybe go in search of. I try to capture the emotion in the book by saying that it was as if we'd been treading water and then started to sink under. All the demands of whatever was going on in our lives, we just gone under, and we could see this light, and it was the surface, and we didn't really know what it was. But of course, you just swim towards that light with all your strength and effort. And so this felt like what we needed to do at that time. I'm going to talk a tiny bit before we get into what happened there about the process of writing a book. And I'm sure, we're a library community. We love books. I'm sure there's authors here. And even if you're, not an author, you probably are an author in waiting. And so writing books, takes blood. I remember taking that shot of, I don't know what had happened to my finger on my keyboard, but it took 6 years. This was a tough book for me to write for a number of reasons. And I'll go through a few. Basically, the story of a young family of two kind of preschool children in a mud brick room for month after month does not scream driving narrative and engagement. And so I had to really think hard about what I wanted to convey. I was writing about my wife and my boys, which I discovered was much, much harder than writing about a ski partner or a climbing partner, to really make them a true and three-dimensional character in all their beauties and honesties, and just make them come alive. That was a major challenge I faced. And one thing specifically that I want to talk about here is getting this book off the ground. Like, it's like a book has to launch, and it requires a huge investment in our attention and in our time to read a book. And I think every author is aware that there's a complex relationship that's being built in the first sentences and paragraphs and pages. And I had a lot to introduce. So I had the characters of our family that I've shared with you to start broaching. I had to pull the veil, or at least start pulling the veil back on this journey that we took on some of the stakes and motivations and I haven't gone into them entirely yet, but you have some sense of them. And the one thing that was an enormous challenge for me was that we actually had a television crew following us on the journey. And I really didn't even want to write about the television crew, because TV and books are just, it's like oil and water. They're two different mediums. Books just feel, and I can say this because we're in a book audience, honest and human and real. And every experience I've had with television is fake and hyped and not what a book represents. And this is, again, a small sliver where my wife and my Venn diagram overlapped. My bigger Venn diagram is that I just say yes to everything and figure it out later. And I'd been talking to a producer. He's like, "Oh, mate, that sounds like an amazing journey. It's like the ultimate family relocation. We should make a show." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, that'd be great. Let's go ahead and pitch it." And then he called me back and he's like, "Travel Channel wants to film it." And I thought, all right, it's going to help pay for it. And I had then talked to Christine and said, there's a chance like a TV crew might want to come with us. She's quite shy, and not shy, but she's not an extrovert. Let's put it that way. And a little more restrained than me. But I said, I think we should do this the long way round style, like Ewan McGregor. If you've seen that, it's gritty, it's real. This is a chance for us to share our vision of travel, our vision of the world, our belief in travel with children, and opening them to other cultures and ways of thinking. And I just said, we'll have one camera person and they'll be embedded with us and it'll be great. And that's kind of what we both thought. And then I got a call from the producers and I said, well, that's how we'd like to do it. He's like, oh, mate, Travel Channel's got a different vision. They've got a budget for crew of 16. We've got 8 helicopter overpasses. And I'm like, oh my God. I mean, I'm really in over my head at this point. I am not going to talk a lot about the TV crew today because the deal we made was that they would leave us when we arrived at the monastery, which they did. And this book is all about what happened at the monastery. The irony, so this ended up in a 9-hour documentary series on Travel Channel called Big Crazy Family Adventure, which is a horrible title for a TV show. But what it's done is provided the boys with a 9-hour home video, which they love. And it's provided we with the opportunity to show you us arriving, literally the moment of our arrival at this monastery. So I'm going to just quickly show you this. And this is from the show. And this is us walking up and meeting Lama Wangal.
I can't stop pinching myself and thinking, how can this be real?
I'm like, what is going on? Is this my son?
So the truth is, the TV crew would have had no place at that monastery, and it would have diluted and it would have destroyed everything that we experienced there. But they left, and that was the last thing they ever filmed. And then we settled in, and we were taken in by Lama Wangal. We had prearranged loosely that friends of friends knew the Lama. We wrote to a nephew, and he knew we were coming. And that's all we really knew. But Lama Wangal was an extraordinary man that we developed deep relationships with. He really guided us through this experience. He became a grandfather and very much a father-like figure to me. My father was lost in an accident about 25 years ago. And I just found extraordinary similarities between Lama Wangal and my own father. And so we spent the next 4 months in an 8-foot by 8-foot earthen room. There was no power, no flush toilet, no running water. And it was truly one of the most peaceful, most simple, and most beautiful times of my life. It was just this extraordinary confluence that just felt right. It felt like we had reached the surface. We woke every morning to the sound of horns and climbed that steep hillside and spent anywhere between half an hour and 5 hours in the puja hall with the monks praying. And then we would often help out around town with doing different things in the village. And then at the end of each day, we taught, Christine and I, along with Bodhi and Taj, taught English and mathematics to a group of 17 novice monks. And they were beautiful boys. We fell deeply in love with them. They became the constant companions of my own 2 boys. We purposely left all our distractions at home. Well, of course, no TVs, but no phones, no tablets, no computers. And of course, everyone said, you can't do that. Your boys will die without Minecraft and Super Mario Brothers and who knows what else. And they were fine. We watched them play with rubber bands and popsicle sticks and pieces of discarded yarn. And they were as enraptured and engaged and as joyous as I've ever seen them in their young lives. And so as days kind of flowed into weeks, flowed into months, this extraordinary community of novices and lamas, the village that supported it and it supported this entire valley, which is really lost within the Himalayas, started to come into focus for us. And so before I talk about that, I'm just going to briefly, if you're not familiar with Zanskar, I don't know if anyone's been to Zanskar, explain where the valley is and set the stage. So Zanskar is an enormous valley in the depths of the Himalaya. It's really tucked in the rain shadow of the Himalaya and on the edge of the Himalayan Tibetan plateau. And its most defining feature is undoubtedly its inaccessibility. There's simply no easy way in or out of this valley. It's formed by the union of 2 really big mountain rivers that come together in the floodplains you see out here. And then they crash through a very, very narrow canyon with class 5 whitewater, and it freezes over. You may have heard of it. It's called the Chadar that butter traders would pass in the winter occasionally. But it took essentially 10 days on foot to just get to Zanskar. And so for over a millennia, about 10,000 local villagers had basically existed here in an agrarian lifestyle. There's 40 or so villages within this valley, perched on the edges of the mountains, where glacial water tumbles down. They use this for irrigation and carefully created fields. The fields all come from composting and fertilizer, human and animal fertilizer. And that soil is just, invaluable because the rest of the valley is all glacial till. And it was in the 8th century that Himalayan Tibetan Buddhism entered the valley, and it quickly took hold. Pretty soon, a quarter of the male population had entered monasteries, and these monasteries, very stately, sprung up in the most, unlikely positions, in huge caves, atop spires, on cliffs like Karshigampa, and all of that was meant to balance the necessity of proximity to an alms-bearing village with a kind of meditative seclusion for the monastic community. And it was in 1834 that, by a real quirk of fate, that Zanskar's fortunes changed, and a small Dogra raiding party under the auspices of the Maharaja of Jammu Kashmir visited. They were on a mission, if you will, to increase Pashmina wool production for the Maharaja, but they claimed Zanskar for the Maharaja, and it basically meant that it tilted from its fortunes from the Tibetan plateau to the subcontinent. And for this, 100 years later, Zanskar was spared the crushing annexation of Tibet. It was spared the ensuing atrocities of the Cultural Revolution. And so even today, to varying extents, this is one of the last remaining flames of that great kind of act of human imagination that was Tibetan Buddhism, this empire that flourished on the Tibetan plateau, and has seen such extraordinary struggles lately. So it was what is known often as one of the last places where Tibetan Buddhism is practiced freely in its original setting. And so this is the world that we entered. And I'm going to take you to a scene about 3/4 of the way through the book now, to talk about some of the more important things that I wanted to share with the writing of this book. And Lama Wengel, who you can see in his monk's robes, has taken us to one of his sister's farms, Lamo, and who's in the purple jersey here, to help with the physically intensive process of harvest. And it was there during, and this is a very, very demanding time of year, during the pulling of barley, the carrying of alfalfa, the threshing of peas, that I came to understand a social construct within Zanskar known as the Paspun. And the Paspun is a group of 3 or 4 households that are bonded together very closely. They usually share some critical religious artifacts that they keep in one of their chapels, or on an altar that's commonly owned between them. But more importantly, they support each other during the really physically intensive times of planting and of harvest. And they also cradle each other throughout the whole journey of life, through birth and marriage and sickness and death. The Paspun is there to help. And it's a repository of knowledge. It's a source of strength. And it is a term for which we have no equivalent in the English language. It's not that we don't have the word, we don't even have that concept. It's not something familiar or recognizable to us. And so not for the first time, I was humbled by the Zanskaris, and I was aware of how much that I had to learn, or could learn from this culture. And there out in the fields, Lamo's father, 88 years old, was kind of using a machete to take the bark off of poplar sticks for fence posts. His wife was 86 years old or something, was watching village children. Doda, 74, toothless, mute, clearly developmentally delayed, was there working with everyone, carrying peas here, sitting by the fire at night, sharing in the communal meal. She was an important part of that community. And I was so starkly aware this wasn't how things happened at home. And as I said, I was again humbled, aware of how much that I had to learn. There was another force at play in those fields that I think is important to mention, and that was the farm beside Lamo and Dorjes lay fallow. And this was unthinkable. I mean, the field's never, the field was the most valuable possession any family ever had. In Tibetan tradition, all the family's land was passed down to the oldest son. Tibetans don't see themselves as owners of the land. They see themselves as guardians or custodians to be passed on to future generations. There is no concept of private real estate historically within the Tibetan Empire, because you couldn't sell it. You didn't own it. You passed it on to your children. And yet the farm beside Dorje's had been sold to a Chinese multinational, and it was sitting there unused. And this was, blasphemous almost to Dorje. It was certainly upsetting. The reason that it was laid fallow, I'm just going to move on to the next one, is, sounds at first as if it's a good thing, because this family, neighboring family, had great fortune. All three of their children had been accepted into private schools outside of the valley. So they had left. But now the elders, the mother and father, were unable to work this land. They don't describe land in terms of acres or hectares. They describe it in terms of days. And so a 5-day field would take 5 days for a man and wife partner to harvest. They had a 47-day farm. With two of them, they couldn't do it. So they had sold it reluctantly, and they had built a roadside shack on the edge of a dirt track that was going to be pushed over the mountains towards Jammu and Kashmir, essentially, and then connected with Manali, in the hope that they would soon be able to sell soda pop and ramen noodles to long distance truck drivers. And so what I was witnessing was this entire way of being that was so delicately balanced evaporating and falling apart before our eyes. And soon these fields would be overrun by, migrant workers from the South. No judgment, no problem against them. But of course, they would not be a member of a PASPUN. They wouldn't support any of this that every other single family in all of Zanskar belonged to. And so this road that was being cut into Zanskar, that's now been connected, has been in the process of being paved in the name of really moving military convoys more quickly to the sensitive northern frontiers. But it's changed the distance from Manali to Leh from 40 hours to 4, will forever alter Zanskar. And it's already altered it unrecognizably since we were been there. So there is this theme of sadness that I'm trying to struggle with in the book. And I came to view Zanskar as this extraordinary metaphor, physical metaphor for, I think, what we've seen in so many remote and indigenous communities across North America and around the world. And I think as travelers, we've all struggled with and tried to, but at times we throw our hands up in helplessness. We feel like we're combating with bigger powers than we really can have any effect on, but yet something doesn't quite feel right. And so the metaphor that I saw within Zanskar was this incredible little cradle of life lost within the Himalayan mountains. Here, hidden behind these peaks from all the world, was this extraordinary kind of testament of human ingenuity, of imagination, of commitment that had created this Zanskari culture. And unaware to all of them on the outside, the floodwaters of modernity beyond those peaks were rising and rising and rising. And of course, those peaks were going to be broached. And when that happened, and it has been happening, and modernity and homogeneity flood in, incredibly important things will come to the Zanskaris: education, medical advances. Even today in Zanskar, women time their childbirth for summer so they're able to leave the valley and safely give birth in the capital of Leh. I mean, we would not wish that. We would not begrudge that advance on anyone and the rigors of the life they lead. There's no argument against that. But I was very clear that as those floodwaters came in, lost in that rush would be all these extraordinary skills and gifts and ways of viewing the world. They just sink in that muddy water and go down. And I was in the very process of learning and feeling like I could see how important these were as I was seeing that they would be lost. And so I think a large part of the book is my questioning of the one-way model of development, this idea that we bring development to people. There's developed countries and developing countries, and it tends to be a very one-way street. And so I was trying to make an argument for the subtle importance of this being a two-way transaction. And one of the things that the Zanskaris have an extraordinary ability with, as do many Himalayan Buddhists, is attention, which is the very thing that I went to try to understand a bit better. And I opened my book with a epigraph from Simone Weil, who wrote in a letter to a friend that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. And those words, that concept really struck me. This idea that the greatest gift we have is what we put our attention on. It's constantly flowing out of us. It's this gift we have the opportunity to bestow on others, on family, on friends, on community at any time. And yet it is very actively being strip mined away from us, and we don't have the tools to combat that. Whereas the Zanskaris had fairly advanced forms of tools for combating that, even though they weren't fighting all the Facebooks and Googles that we were. Of course, Buddhism is based on the taming of the monkey mind, on living in the very present now. But even out on the fields during harvest, it was the little snippets of scripture that would be whispered in lulls of conversation. It was the mala beads in hand. It was the rice thrown over the shoulder. All of that was a reminder that we are right here, right now, and this is the moment that matters. And so I struggled quite a bit and make light of it in the book with meditation, because that's the most familiar, I think, incarnation in the Western world that we have of managing our attention. But one who did not struggle with meditation was my older son, Bodhi. And it came so naturally to him. And I've often thought how he's always shown this extraordinary comfort with Buddhism. He, from the earliest age, literally, I mean, like we had him out in tents when he was 3 months, but by the time he could speak at 2 years of age, he would not let us kill a mosquito in the tent. And I can tell you, on long northern canoe trips, this is a horror. You just, as a parent, you just want to whack these things that are full of blood. And no, he wouldn't have any of that. I brought home a Buddha from Cambodia, and he put it by his bed, and he covered it in offerings and feathers and stones. Even his name is a tip of the hat, really, to the Bodhisattva, the Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion, who upon reaching enlightenment forsakes nirvana and returns to our world to help guide others towards deeper understanding. And what could be a more poetic summary of Bodhi's role in my life than that? And in fairness, I have to say that this is another overlap of mine and Christine's Venn diagrams, because I originally suggested Bodhi as a tip of the hat to Patrick Swayze in the movie Point Break, but Christine fully got it, and she saw him as the Bodhisattva. And Bodhi, I quickly came to understand, is far, far more Buddha than he is surfer dude. And so it was in Zanskar, in this land of peace and tranquility, that I bore witness to an extraordinary flourishing of Bodhi. And really, coming to terms is the wrong way of saying it, but I was gifted with an insight into a deeper understanding, a deeper connection with the challenges and opportunities that Bodhi faced, specifically because he's on the autism spectrum. And this is certainly goes early in the book as one of our driving forces for this trip to understand it. And the only thing I'm going to say about this here is that there's a big, I don't want to say controversy, but there are mixed opinions on disclosure of a child's diagnosis. And, there's a large faction out there who will say it's a child's decision, and they should, when they turn 18, you can let them decide if they want to tell anyone about their diagnosis. And I totally get that. On the other hand, I'm like, I am entrusted with navigating this child through the early part of their life. And I'm going to tell him that the central plank that makes him who he is, how he interacts with the world and engages with people and communities and cultures, we're going to keep it a secret. We're not going to tell people about it. To me, that was giving him a message of shame, of hiding something. And I also had the confidence that Bodhi could deal with disclosure, that he was gifted, that his gifts included that this just felt right. All I can say is, as a father, this felt right. And believe me, it was a horrible fear writing this book. He read the book. I wrote it for 6 years. At 4 years, we were on a sea kayak trip on the western coast of Canada. And Bodie brings like 20 books on a sea kayak trip. And he read them all. And so I had this manuscript. I'm like, why don't you read this? And he sat down by the campfire over the next 2 nights and read it. And, every time that I was talking, I knew where he was, and I knew I was talking about autism. I watched him like a hawk, and he didn't and never flinched, but he found a few factual errors. At one point I said we played checkers, and he's like, Dad, we played chess. I'm like, dude, you were like 7 years old at the time. No one will believe chess. He's like, change it. And so he fact checked it, and then he finished up and said, well, it's good, but it's never going to be a New York Times bestseller, which I appreciated, because Bodie is burningly, searingly honest. That wasn't meant to hurt me. That was his truth. Anyways, my worry was that it could be different when he's 18, but all we can do is have faith and try. But what came out was this extraordinary parallel between Bodhi and the Himalayan Buddhists, between, the Buddhism is essentially an abhorrence of distraction, a rootedness in the here and now, and the burning honesty and clarity of the moment. And that's what matters to Bodhi. That's who Bodhi is. And so there in Lamo in his kitchen had this flank of yak that had rotted and desiccated and smelled just terrible. And he would make momos, these dumplings, yak momos. And we just like, we'd all feel ourselves sink in resignation when we heard him in there pounding this yak meat with a rock. And then we'd have these momos show up. And of course, I'd say, they're delicious, Lamo and Bodhi would be like, no, they're not. They're disgusting. They taste horrible. And me and Christine would be like, shh. But what I came to see, the really critical parallel, I think, is that just like the Zanskaris, even though we may pay lip service to respecting their culture and so forth, the act of going into this valley and the modernization of this valley is ultimately an act of colonization. Even if we are super well-intentioned and have the best come from the truest parts of our heart, there's a colonization that's going on. I realized, in essence, we've been colonizing our son. We had been, with all our interventions, with all our efforts to make life more navigable for him, we were bending him towards us. And there was an extraordinary beauty in those differences. And that bending had to be bi-directional. We had to bend towards him, just like we had to bend towards the Zanskaris. And so a large part of this book is about my relationship with Bodhi and that understanding, which is one of the gifts I feel that's never left me from our time there. So I get teary talking about it. It was tough to leave. I mean, we fell in love with these kids. This is 7-year-old Norgay, the Tulku, believed to be an incarnation of the ear whispering lineage, who's got his own amazing story. And we taught him on the first day in class to say, see you tomorrow. And as we walked out of the monastery for the last times, draped in kata scarves, tears running down her face, he was running down the trail behind us saying, see you tomorrow. And it was a question. It wasn't a statement. And it broke our hearts to leave. We trekked out. It took us about 14 days to reacclimatize to any form of modernity. And on our very last night, this was our family after 6 months on the road. We're at the mouth of the Shilla Gorge. We'll be in Wanla tomorrow. And we had a most extraordinary encounter here that I kind of want to recount just to sum up our journey. We as we finished the gorge, a bunch of minivans showed up, and they were young men from one of our guides' villages. And of course, the ancient system of the Paspun endured. He'd called Lay and said, we're coming out of the mountains. And they all had jobs programming computers for the Department of Defense. And they're like, well, we won't work today. We'll go pick up our friend. We're part of the Paspun. And there they were in jeans, nice blue tight jeans and smelling of cologne and perfect puffy jackets. And I looked like Nick Nolte in a mugshot. And one of them spoke extraordinary English, and he sat down beside me in breakfast. He said, well, it's really funny, isn't it? You're dressing up like a Zanskari and we're dressing up like Americans. And I was like, yeah, you're right. It is crazy. And we talked about the changes coming to the valley and how to encapsulate that and how to understand that. And he said, I just want to tell you a story. I was in Zanskar a month ago for the guy the Torbu who trekked us over the mountains, his father's birthday. He's like, yeah, of course I went back for his birthday. He's in my passport, and he's an amazing man. He said he's a farmer. He's a biologist though. He knows like when a certain type of bird arrives, when to plant his crops. He's an engineer. He's made all his plows and tools by hand. He's an aqueduct designer. He's made all these irrigation canals. He's built his house by hand, but that's not it. He's a historian. He knows the history of every family in this village. He knows 4 languages that he can read and write. He's an entertainer. He can sing 200 songs. He doesn't just sing one, he can sing all night long. And he said, and he's not unusual. Every single man and woman in all of Zanskar is like him. And look at me, I can program a computer. That's all I can do. But he's like, what can we do? How can I change that? And so that was, I don't want to end on a note of sadness, but that was some of the challenges facing that Zanskar. Lamo Angel actually came to Delhi with us. He wanted to return to Canada. I desperately wanted to bring him. We developed a deep bond of love, and he was caught in the invisible, unquestionable dragnet trawler of immigration, and the nameless, faceless person who was unaccountable said, no, he can't come to Canada. And we'd bought his plane tickets. We'd assured all his finances. He'd live with us. We had a letter that he had a job on his return to India. And here he was, the most powerful man in Zanskar at one time as the head lama of Karshigampa, still a man of extraordinary prestige and respect, without a credit card and with no power in this world that was about to engulf him. And so we came home, and I fell into the act of writing and worked on this. But I want to end with a little note of hope. Here's Bodhi again with his extraordinary resonance with Buddhism. But there was a fellow called Guru Rinpoche, who was an 8th century Buddhist reformer. And he said, 1,000 years or more ago, in eerily prescient words, that when the iron bird flies and horses run on wheels, which is kind of like what we have today, the Tibetan people will be scattered around the face of the world. And he said, like ants. I like to use the metaphor more as embers. And I would like to think that in that bidirectional bending that I was trying to advocate for in the book, that we can carry embers of other ways within ourselves. We all are born into a culture. We all have a certain way, but we can carry other embers within us. And it certainly Bodhi carries, and I'd like to think all of us carry an ember of that Tibetan culture. It's not enough to represent it or be it, but we carry some ember, and we've bent in some small way towards it. And so I do find hope in Guru Rinpoche's words, and I ended on those in my book. So that's really all I have to say. We can open up to questions and whatnot, but hopefully that took you away from a dark, cold winter's night for just a moment. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you, Bruce.
Lori and Doug. Yeah, I already see a question there. And this is unbelievable, Lori and Doug. I really, as a young man, didn't see myself very strong in languages. We have to learn French in Canada, and I was terrible. And then I failed English at high school, and I failed typing. How on earth did I start writing books? I don't know. But then I had a Swedish girlfriend, and I wanted to understand what she was saying. And I went through the process of really tackling that language like a parrot. Just everything I heard, I said. And all of a sudden, after 3 months, I could speak Swedish. And I've taken great pride in all my journeys. I learned to speak Arabic when we rode the camels. There's been points where Mongolian was very fluent to me. And everywhere I've gone, I've learned a lot. And here on this journey where bending meant so much, I learned a pitiful amount of Zanskari. I had a dictionary to translate it. I was very aware that the greatest gift I could give those young boys in our class was conversational comfort. And just with these words, it felt strange in their mouth. So we all had Tibetan names that Lama Wangel had given us. Mine was Mortub, but I always told them to call me Mr. Bruce. I wanted them to use those words. And so anyways, sadly, Lori and Doug have to report, we communicated mostly in English, small amounts of Tibetan, and rudiments like please and thank you and all that, but not enough. And Bodhi is, Nancy, Bodhi's 13 now. And when so Bodhi flourished extraordinarily. And one thing I didn't touch on in this presentation or conversation was the fact that as an autistic boy, he had found his younger brother a bit of a pain and a bit of an intrusion into the carefully cultivated normalcy and routine of his life up until this journey. And on this journey, I witnessed them become true and deep friends. And, as parents, what more can you possibly dream of? And so this extraordinary bond grew between the two. And then Bodhi came home and had an incredible year at school. And then he got a GI issue. And it's so bad that for the last 2 years, it was like he fell down a well and we couldn't see him at the bottom. Like he stopped speaking. He was in 94% of his weight class and he went down to 17. He was clinically depressed. He cried all day. He missed hundreds of days of school, every 100 days, 1 year, 100 days next year. And I was just saying to Leah, we did everything. Like the Canadian medical system gave up. We took him to Mexico. We took him to Switzerland. We took him to Texas. We took him to New York. It was a full-time job for my wife and I to try to find some way of healing our son. And at Christmas, just in the space of a week, it was like he came out of the well and started talking again and started being happy and is going to school. And so Bodhi is doing well now. And I'm touching wood. We're still hopeful and we're not out of the woods yet, but it continues to have an enduring effect, that journey on I think all members of our family.
Does Bodhi have an easy time getting back into that meditative space outside of the trip, or?
I think he does. One thing that we've meditated every day with Bodhi since we've been home, and I was so proud. I was so proud of him. But then I realized we use a thing called Headspace, and I realized all he cared about was the number count. He didn't really care about the meditation. He was like, we have 878 days in a row. And so we'd go on these long sea kayak trips and he'd give our family iPad to a friend and make them turn on Headspace every day just so the count wouldn't get re-zeroed. But to answer your question more seriously, he has an ability to go to that space instinctively or naturally without the formal structure of meditation. It just happens for him more simply, I think, and he continues to display that. Yeah.
I have a couple questions if everybody's still thinking of theirs. You said earlier that you had a hard time writing about your family as opposed to like friends. Why did you figure out why? Is it because did you figure out why? And then how did they receive reading about themselves? Like you gave that anecdote about Bodhi saying, yeah, not a bestseller. How did Bodhi interpret your interpretation of him and the rest of your family as well?
Yeah. So the hardness, it was interesting. I gave an early copy of a book to an editor to look at, and he said, Christine's always whispering. I mean, you're portraying her as a very weak woman. And I felt really bad about that because she's not a weak woman at all. And then I thought about it and I was like, the only time I could talk with Christine on this journey is when the kids are asleep and they're in a room 4 feet away from us. So all we did was whisper. It was the way we lived. But that said, I guess I became aware that I developed skills in writing to really bring someone into a natural environment, into the desert or onto a river or onto a mountain that I felt super comfortable with and were just instinctive. And to kind of reveal the dynamics within a group that were evolving in those situations, but that they were very different with the family. And so all I can say in terms of like discovering if I had a weakness that I had to address it was just something that I had to work on. I would like to think that I carried the ball further than I would have at the start. I'd like to think I could probably carry the ball further in the future. Writing's this kind of endless progression. But you try to cast out of your head worries. And I don't feel the conscious worry, like, oh, Christina won't like, I use that adjective to describe her, or, to portray the conversation that way. She loved the book. She probably loved the fact it was written too, because I started showing up a lot more around the house. And, she takes a toll too for me writing. Taj, I'd like to read it to at bedtime. He'll love it. He loves everything. And Bodhi, part of the way that he sees the world that I'd like to bend towards a little bit more, he would never, as far as I can interpret so far, feel that he was being cast in any light. Like the only things that concerned him, like, as I said, were the factual errors. And so if he felt everything I said about him was true, he would never flinch. He wouldn't think that I made, we would, I don't want to, I'll use the term neurotypical, which is a term in the autism community, but by and large, we share a sensitivity to how we're portrayed or perceived by others. And Bodhi is just so beautifully immune to that. He will wear a shirt of any color, of any design, from any thrift store, as long as it's comfortable. And he won't wear it if it's not comfortable. And it will truly not cross his mind what his peers would think of it once. And his friends are now, crippled by, does this jacket look good? Are they cool? Should I have maybe that will come for one day, and it comes at a cost for Bodhi, but he doesn't feel that type of outside perception. And so he's marvelously immune to some of the things I wrote about him, I think. And not that I ever would try to write anything harmful. I hope that answers the question, Leah. Shannon, oh, you read the book. Thank you, Shannon. You're talking about horse riding. So I'll just share that with everyone briefly. An interesting manifestation for Bodhi, we believe, of his autism was a lack of comfort around animals. There's a lot of nonverbal communication with animals, and that's really difficult stuff for Bodhi. And animals will also look at you quite directly in the eye, which is discomforting for Bodhi. And so, Taj, you just see a dog or a cat, he'll sprint a mile to just pet this thing for a moment and run back. Bodhi will, a dog will come up and lick his hand, or, he'll just turn his back on it. And so we got Bodhi riding a horse on the way into the monastery and the way out. And he found this extraordinary comfort with that. It was really special. And so, yeah, meditation was another thing. Did you, Christine, or Taj discover hidden skills? Taj, I'd say, was probably too young. Taj was really, Taj's discovery was his brother as a friend, and Bodhi in reverse. Boy, Christine or me are tougher ones. And the only thing I could say that for me is that understanding of attention as a gift, and my ability to try and jolt it back. So while meditative practice is important, I find, if you're in a lineup at the grocery store and someone butts in front of you, or a car takes the last parking spot or something, I find the ability to use breath as a kind of centering thing, take a couple breaths, remind myself I'm right here. I use more than the equanimity that kind of spreads larger over the life from, a kind of meditative practice every morning or night. For me, it's more in the moment that's been the enduring change. And Christina, this is why I didn't write about her. I don't know if she discovered a hidden skill. My one vision I have of her, which is just so beautiful, is we had both curry spice and chai spices, chai masala spice that we put in the tea, which was ground from, kind of raw herbs. But once every 2 weeks, you would get out this beautiful big rock mortar and pestle and just grind these spices that we'd use for the next 2 weeks. And she'd be covered in dust, and her clothes would be covered in dust. And I could really tell she was finding a peace in the simplicity of that. We both have a respect for that kind of simple way of living. So that's when you asked that was the first vision that came to mind.
Do you know what changed, or what the conditions were that allowed your sons to finally become deep friends?
Here's my take, and you can never know for sure, but we've always we've always gone on big family trips together. And you hear this adage that children spell love Time. And I've just found that to be so true. Like, I feel like we created a deep reservoir of a bond between all of us on this journey, but it needs to be replenished. So nearly every summer we do a 30-day canoe trip, and I can feel something deep in between us when all the other distractions of life are taken away and we exist as a family. It's in a situation that Bodie's comfortable with. Everyone, we have a place in the tent. Everyone brings one stuffy, or the boys do. And, it's like home away from home, and they're good there. And for me, very deep bonds formed with the boys and Christine during those experiences. And I think that Bodie and Taj, A, removed from all the distractions of home, B, they were really the only two English speaking children. They needed each other. They in fact, for the first time, glimpsed what it was like. Dad's frustrated with this train ticket and mom can't find anything but bananas and peanut butter to eat and everything's too spicy. Let's just hang out and play Lego. And we each gave them one toiletry bag that they were able to fill with Lego. And so they had a few little pieces, and they played a lot together. And I think it was simply because there was no other option that they discovered a joy in that. And I think, and honestly, it sounds weird, but I think for Bodie, it was one of his first friendships. Those friendships came so instinctively for Taj. He'd formed many at preschool, but for Bodie, he would parallel play. He'd have people over, but they would be doing separate things in the same space. And all of a sudden he was doing something with Bodie. And then there was a kind of real beauty in him learning that with his own brother.
There's one more question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Oh, you know what? They, unfortunately, no. The question is it possible to watch I made a presentation at Banff, and then I had a discussion with John Valiant. And I'll say a word or two about John in a sec, but for some weird reason, because of their logistic things, they're not able to share that. The Banff Festival goes on world tour, and it comes to our local town, and the festival organizers were asking me, here, can we show your thing? And I said, oh, I'm sure you'll be able to, but no, for some legality, it got stopped by some pencil pushing, stopped it. But so I'll tell you one last story. Do you have time for 3-minute story? It's quite quick. The book before this got demolished in the Globe and Mail. It got a review that was so bad that it killed the book. The book, so publishers in Canada pay roughly $10,000 a week to have, people don't know this, but to have the books on the front tables. At that time, it was of Indigo and Chapters are big chains. My publisher, the review was so bad, I know my publisher just gave up. I was with a big publisher, and they had other books coming, and it was just done. And it truly broke my heart. I worked for a long time on that book, and I'm not saying this to like play the little fiddle. I was on tour with the book. I was in Ottawa, and I was a 35-year-old guy. I couldn't stop crying. I'd just walk down the street and I'd be in tears, and I knew it was done. And it took me a long, long time. It was 15 years since I wrote another book after that. And part of the weird capital that goes into a book are these endorsements, what's called blurbs on the back of a book. And I bumped into John Valiant, who wrote The Golden Spruce and Jaguar's Children and The Tiger, which you absolutely should. Is just a literary icon to me. And I basically hunted John down and on Twitter said, can we meet for beer? And he said, okay. And we actually had dinner together at Banff. He didn't remember. There'd been a bunch of people at the table. And he's like, do I know you? When I walked into the pub, and he said, okay, I'll take a look at your book. And I didn't know if anything was going to come in. And literally 5 minutes before they locked the pages, his blurb came in. And all I can say is it was just so touching for me. It was the completion of a circle. I realized I'd finally got over that bad review, to have someone like John endorse the book. And when your book gets reviewed, about 80% of people just regurgitate the editor's notes. About 15% kind of pass some opinion. And then once with my first book, Sandance, a person who was reviewing the book said things that I knew were true, but that I hadn't realized until I read them. And though it's kind of an extraordinary type of review when you read someone who is seeing things in your writing that are true, but you didn't even realize yourself. And that was a really magical thing. And John, the same thing happened with John. He saw stuff in the book that I hadn't even really put my finger on. And so anyways, I had a great conversation with him at Banff, but unfortunately I have no way of sharing it with you.
All right, any last questions from anyone? And we still have one, I just remember this, we have one free book of Blue Sky Kingdom available to give away at curbside. So whoever gets to the library first tomorrow, it's yours, and just come and get it. And there's also one more copy left of Stranger in the Woods by Michael Finkel about the hermit in Maine who lived off the grid for 27 years. But thank you, Bruce, for coming and spending your time with us and sharing your story. That was lovely. And if you wanted to, we just recorded it, so you can watch this again if you like. And come next week for Irene Yee, or the Climb So Climb, climbing photography, and Michael Finkel about The Stranger in the Woods.